So, hello everyone. Welcome to this Transform Finance webinar on exploring alternative ownership enterprises globally. Um, a lot of you may be familiar with some of the recent work that we've been doing around alternative ownership enterprises like employee ownership, steward ownership, looking at multi-stakeholder models. And a lot of our work so far has been focused on North America and particularly the US. However, as all of you know, this is not specific to the US. There are parts of the world that are far advanced in many ways in terms of building out different ways of doing business. And today, I'm really excited about this amazing group of speakers we have who are going to give kind of sampling of what those different contexts look like. And the way that this webinar is going to work is we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but then we have an extra 30 minutes to have some breakouts with the speakers to really get deep. And this was a format that we've tried out before and people seem to like. So I hope we can have some good conversations there at the end. A couple quick house cleaning notes. Again, please share who you are, what organization you're with, what brings you to this webinar in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. This is a meeting, not a webinar format for Zoom, so everyone can see the chat. So use that as you would in a normal Zoom meeting. One new thing that we have today, given this global scale of talking about alternative ownership enterprise, is we have not just captions, but also live translation from Zoom. So if you go down to the bottom bar, you can see this show captions button. It might be in that more menu with the three dots. And if you toggle that translation on, you can select your preferred language that you speak and your caption language. And that will just show up for you. So everyone can customize that. I cannot promise that Zoom has the best live translation, but it's what we have to work with today. Before I jump in, I just want to say my colleague Julie Mentor it was slated to lead this webinar, and unfortunately she had a family urgent thing come up, so I'm filling in for her. So we miss Julie's practiced and wonderful voice on this, but fortunately we will really be hearing mostly from the speakers. But my name is Kurt Lyon. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance. We are a nonprofit organization that creates insights, connections, and actionable strategies for investors who are really trying to build new kinds of investment models that are transformative and shift power and equity. We have three transformative finance principles here that all of our work is really built around. And those are that those affected by investments can design, govern, and share in the ownership of investments. Investors add more value than what they extract in terms of returns, and that risks and returns are fairly allocated across all stakeholders. Our current work is really building off of our historical work in the alternative ownership space, the shared ownership space. So things like employee ownership, participatory investment funds, real estate models that are shared by community members and have different kinds of co-ownership. This is a thread that we believe is really important when we're talking about these principles and building a new kind of finance that can actually shape markets and shape outcomes for people who are historically excluded from the benefits of capital. And so just a quick primer on ownership. Conventional enterprise ownership consolidates wealth and power. You may have heard the term shareholder primacy and what it means for investors to have legal and governance rights primarily and have those rights protected over other stakeholders like workers, communities, nature even. So a lot of these alternative corporate structures exist to share that wealth more equitably, share governance more equitably, and can be committed to a long-term mission. So folks who have read some of our materials on alternative ownership enterprises will see this Venn diagram where you see different models with different combinations of centering workers, centering purpose, centering other stakeholders. And we're going to hear about models that are centering these other stakeholders rather than investors across the world today. Just a couple points. There's no one size fits all. So when we talk about all of these different models, let's really think about how they can apply to different contexts. In some cases, it makes a lot more sense to have investors included in the participation in governance. Whereas sometimes, if the workers are creating a company, they prefer to just keep it within their particular community. So think about this idea of how these different contexts, and we're going to hear from many different regions in the world that have different contexts, kind of influence and shape the actual enterprise model themselves. So I'm really happy to start to introduce our speakers. Our agenda for today, we have 6 speakers who are going to do a form of the lightning talk format that you may have seen at some conferences. We'll have some 3-4 minute presentations. Then we'll have an audience Q&A. And then, like I mentioned, at the very end, the last half an hour, we're actually going to break out where each speaker is going to host their own conversation, and we can really dig into the burning questions that you have. So I'm really happy to introduce Harvey Koh at Dahlberg and Catalytic Capital Consortium, Micah Kaufman at the Purpose Foundation, Nelson Rodriguez Harvey at Purpose Latin America, Rachel Bachman at the Institute for Economic Democracy, Juan Hardon Pina at the Predistribution Initiative, and Erinch Sahan at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Harvey, our first speaker. And I also just like to remind folks to really use the chat for questions. We'll be keeping track of those, and we will come back to those at the end for the audience Q&A. So with that, Harvey, I'll send it over to you.
Thanks, Kurt, and hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So yeah, great to be with you all today. Want to present some of the work that we recently wrote up with my colleague Laura Maya from Dahlberg in SSIR about AOE success stories in the Global South, to really building on the work that Transform Finance have sort of laid out for the world in terms of AOEs more in the US context, to show that actually this is not a US only story, but a global one. We talked through a few examples in the SSIR piece, but the 3 really large scale success stories come from Kenya, Colombia, and India. So Kenya tea, Colombia coffee, and India dairy. I mean, it started in dairy, but actually now GCMMF produces a huge range of consumer products in India and internationally. But I thought I might choose one example to go into, which is Kenya, and spend more time going into that for this presentation. But the article speaks to the others at a high level too. And I will say also that these are examples of I guess worker/producer ownership, right? Because actually these are the growers in these industries, the smallholder organized industries that are that the owners in these enterprises. And so Kenya tea, if I go way back to the beginning, because we need to understand where these things come from, it was a colonial enterprise, right? So for 100 years or so, it's been grown in these estates in Kenya that were set up under colonial rule. They still exist today. There are still issues today that are unresolved from those times, and conflicts over land and land ownership. But what was interesting is around the sort of middle of the 20th century, there was this realization that actually tea, even though it had not been planted by smallholders anywhere in the world successfully, could actually work in Kenya. And after Kenyan independence in 1963, KTDA was set up, initially actually under a model of steward ownership, which I'll get into as a sort of parastatal with some external investors involved. And then later on, from about 2000, liberalized and put into smallholder ownership. And so KTDA, just a quick snapshot. I say today, most of this, some of this is the facts as of today, and then some of it's data from when we did the research back in 2012-13, or the first phase of research. Certainly now one of the leading global producers of high quality tea, a huge producer of tea, a major foreign exchange earner for Kenya, so a very successful commercial enterprise. It's owned by over 600,000 smallholder tea growers. And what's interesting is actually that's a commonality across all the three large-scale examples is that the producers own the local sort of unit of production, in this case, the local tea factories, and then they in turn own KTDA, who provide management services to the factories. And then KTDA overall also then owns a whole range of subsidiaries, which do things like credit and energy. So these small hydro projects that I've got on the list here, um, financial products, logistics and warehousing, and so on. And so it's a really interesting structure that has sort of grown organically, but that has allowed some of the benefits that I'll describe in a second through this structure. And of course, the benefit that we see is that if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, which we did in 2013-14, is the payouts to smallholders from the tea value chain are much, much higher in Kenya compared to other neighboring countries which are tea producing, partly because it's actually more profitable and more money comes in, and then obviously because the smallholders actually own the enterprise that is producing these surpluses. I would note the number in Rwanda, which you see there is very low, has come up substantially in recent years, thanks to some work by Gatsby Africa and the Wood Family Trust with the Rwandan government, taking over a number of tea factories, and also with KTDA support. So this is also a story that is starting to replicate beyond Kenya's borders. And then I will just note before I go to the lessons that we learned, we noted that success was not assured, right? So when this all started, there was a huge array of challenges in the way for Kenya smallholder tea, which had never been done before. And we noted that actually other AOE agri-value chain initiatives in Kenya and in neighboring countries did not achieve the level of success of KTDA, right? And so the question we asked was, why did KTDA succeed where others failed? And so broadly, what were the lessons that were learned? One, which seems obvious, but actually these are businesses, right? So to do a successful, to have a successful business, you need teams which are strong professional managers and with strong business acumen. This was not present, in the 1960s or easily available in the 1960s, where native Kenyans were being brought into the tea industry for the first time with no history. And so what was interesting was this strategy of essentially co-opting the enemy. And in this case, it was hiring the commercial tea estates from the colonial era, Brooke Bond, George Williamson, and so on, as managing agents for the factories in the first 10 years, and then using them to train up a cohort of ethnic Kenyans, of native Kenyans, who could then take over after the first 10 years of growth, which proved to be very successful. The second is, the nature and structure of the business itself reinforces the key drivers of value. So even though smallholder tea had not been done before, there was early work that said, actually, this is well suited to smallholders, right? It doesn't need to be irrigated because it's rain fed, manual plucking. So you'll see me there holding 2 leaves and a bud, which is basically, the standard for high quality tea. And it's much easier to do this. It's very hard to do this with automated methods. And so manual plucking is an advantage. As I said before, the ownership and production is all decentralized. So basically, smallholders own shares in their local factories. Each factory sells their product at auction internationally separately. And then there's a weekly price report back to the smallholders of all the prices achieved by all the factories at auction, right? And so everyone knows and has an incentive to improve quality so that they get the rewards, whilst also maximizing the benefits of scale through the overall KTDA complex, which runs across 66 factories. The third is, there was a huge range of challenges for this, right? No ecosystem, limited planting, limited knowledge, racism, all these things were present in the 1960s when this was started. And so in this case, and that's not the same for all AOEs, there was a huge role played by political leadership and championing, as well as the sort of movements, around independence that came with that. So Kenyatta's Africanization policy, and then its structure as a parastatal, but so not with sole state control, but with outside investors taking important seats as co-investors in the whole piece. And then also, all this support helped it to build the ecosystem around R&D and infrastructure and extension services that were needed. And then finally, of course, investment. And in this case, the point we would make is the right catalytic capital early in the journey was critical, right? So we had the World Bank providing loans for things like planting and nurseries, infrastructure. CDC, now BII, British International Investment, came in as an equity investor in the tea factories, made sure that they were, they actually both organizations took board roles at different levels within KTDA, as well as secondments and provision of expertise. So, having all of this actually in the period of steward ownership allowed it to develop and kind of stick to the right path in partnership with government, and to some extent protected it against excessive state interference that might have led it down the path of the other less successful examples. So then in more recent times, there's been more conventional investment into the subsidiaries of KTDA. So let me just pause there. I'm sure we'll get into a lot more detail as we get into the breakouts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey. And this is a good reminder. Obviously, we could just have each of our speakers here today go for the entire time, but that's why we have that time at the end to really have the breakout groups where you can ask your specific questions that are relevant for any particular speaker. And at this point, before we move on to Mike, I actually want to launch a quick poll, which is just asking where folks in the room are focused on in their work. We have it divided by continent. So I think that'll actually help us figure out when we do breakouts, how many folks to expect in different place-specific rooms. So I'm going to let this poll go, but also hand it over to Maike to start her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kurt, and everyone at Transform Finance for providing us this platform for sharing learnings. I'll just share my screen as well. I hope you see it. Yes, cool. No, I just have to see it as well. All right, here we are. My name is Maike Kaufmann. I'm co-lead of the Purpose Foundation, and for the past 10 years, roughly, the Purpose Foundation has been working to advance and support the model of steward ownership, really working to inspire and enable actors around the world to make steward ownership more known, more accessible. And we kind of defined the term of steward ownership based on the many, many examples of companies that have already found their way to steward ownership themselves, which is what I am about to talk about as well. So when talking about alternative ownership models and really steward ownership more specifically, we're talking less about who is owning a company and more about how a company is owned. And as Kurt mentioned in the beginning, with ownership in conventionally structured companies often, really being wealth ownership, so the shareholders having access to the value and the profits of the company. And steward ownership is really structured as stewardship, where the owners are stewards of the company, stewarding it in the future to further its purpose in the long run. And really, steward ownership decouples money and power. And it's doing that by enshrining two core principles to the company. And the first principle is the principle of self-determination, meaning that the control, so the last instance of power over the companies, lies with people who are closely connected to the company. It lies with stewards, not absentee owners who are really far away and don't understand what's going on, but with stewards who actually know and understand the company. Control over the company cannot be inherited, bought, or be speculated with, but is really passed on in trust from steward to whoever is the right person to bring the company into the future. And the second principle is the principle of purpose orientation. That means that in these companies, profits and making profits is not the goal in itself, but profits are means to the purpose of the company. And also value created in these companies cannot be extracted by the shareholders. Profits in state-owned companies are reinvested, donated. They can be used to cover capital costs. It can be entrepreneurially freely used, but they are not there for personal benefits. And these two principles in steward-owned companies are enshrined in a legally binding way. And this allows the companies to really stay independent in the long run and put purpose first, even though that purpose can change over time with, well, the evolving history that we all live in. In Europe, we've seen the model of steward ownership popping up throughout the last decades, but in really centuries, by many different companies in all different parts of Europe. And it's really interesting because it's kind of naturally they all, even way before there was a term for steward ownership, they all found their way to the same principles and same kind of technical principles of steward ownership by themselves. You could say it's kind of a convergent evolution. And just picking out a few of these cases, we have companies like Bosch, a global engineering and technology company based in Germany with over 400,000 employees. And when Robert Bosch founded the company, he built it up to be really there for innovation that serves society, that serves people. And when like in the last years of his life, he thought very long about how he could actually find a succession solution that would ensure that his values and the nature of Bosch and its focus on driving innovation would really be passed on over generations and would not get lost. So after trying out a few things, actually his lawyers worked out a double foundation model where money and control is separated into two different entities, and the principles of steward ownership are legally enshrined. But not only for like larger and kind of more family-oriented businesses, steward ownership can be a solution, but also for startups that really want to stay mission-driven and independent. And a great example for that is Ecosia, the search engine that plants trees. It's the largest independent search engine in Europe. And Christian Kroll, its founder, really had to deal with the problem that he wanted to make the promise that no matter what, and no matter how much money there would be on the table, he would never compromise the independence and purpose of Ecosia by selling it to a large competitor or to someone else, but that he would actually that Ecosia would stay true to itself, even when Christian Kroll was not in the shareholding or like ownership position anymore. And he also found a steward ownership model using a golden share. So we have foundation ownership, we have golden share ownership, and also in Europe, we often use trust ownership, depending on the country you're in, to implement steward ownership. And a third kind of company type, I guess, that often implements steward ownership are companies like Buurtzorg. I don't know whether I pronounce it correct. It's a mental health care provider in the Netherlands, and they're just a really awesome company. They are working with decentralized and self-managed teams. And for them, it was really all about finding an ownership structure that fitted their way of thinking about their company, thinking about ownership, and thinking about the way they work. And they wanted to find an ownership structure that was more coherent for how they wanted the company to well go into the future. And so same here, steward ownership was an option for them. And when rethinking ownership, obviously, particularly looking at that value of the company stays within the company, cannot be extracted by shareholders, and that profits serve the purpose as well. We also have to talk about financing. And really, there are many different ways of financing steward-owned businesses. There are many ways of steward ownership-aligned financing. You can use specific forms of equity, specific forms of debt, mezzanine financing. And in steward ownership aligned financing, we always ensure that the control of the company remains with the stewards and that the company doesn't have to get sold so that investors get paid back. But still, investors get a risk adequate, but in some manner capped return. And this field is well old, but also emerging. So as I said, we're working with equity, mezzanine, and debt, but we also are still working on the best fitting solutions for steward-owned companies to get finance. So there might also be a completely different quality of finance that we don't know about yet. And with that, thank you very much. I would like to pass on to Kurt.
Thank you, Maike. Your work and Purpose's work has been so influential for Transform Finances throughout the year. I think one of my first webinars at the organization was in 2017 with the Purpose team and Kickstarter, and that was a really, really just like informative session for me personally. I'm sharing the results of the poll right now in case folks are curious, just the distribution of folks in the room. Unsurprisingly, lots of folks here in North America, which is where a lot of our connections are, but it's really great to see actually like a pretty even distribution across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'm really excited for, kind of the breakouts on those conversations, and then to our European friends. So glad you're here. We've been really deepening our relationships with a lot of you all, and I hope this is a helpful conversation. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it to Nelson. And I would like to remind folks to use the chat for questions. I'm collecting them, and we'll come back to the Q&A with the full group before we do breakouts. So yeah, Nelson, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Well, we are the Latin American chapter of Purpose, and here locally we have seen a phenomenon of trying to bring from north many examples and benchmark to the south, and it's been great in many ways, but challenging in some others. That's why we have been working since 2019 here, bringing this benchmark. But now, after taking the attention of many people, we realize that we need to also make an assessment on what is happening here locally. That's why we decided to, using the lens of steward ownership, enter in a mapping project here locally, and we are identifying here case studies, in both cases, emerging companies and more mature. Actually, Harvey talked about Juan Valdez, this coffee company, and this is one of the cases we are mapping to today. And we identify here locally there is a need of these concepts, and many companies are now embracing governance and legal frameworks and prioritizing a long-term mission over this short-term profit. And that's why we are gathering real examples from companies. We have now 50 case studies and on a diversity of models, all of them connected more to the LATAM context that is quite different from some examples that we have from North America or Europe. There are companies here in basic services like finance and health, and cases of succession where ownership is a matter, and the ownership was passed to a foundation, as Mike just mentioned, is one of the ways of doing it. But also we found a lot of associative and producer-based models as Juan Valdez and other as indigenous-based too, many examples of that. At the end of this year, we will publish this report, but not only in a physical way, but also in a digital platform that we hope to host of these cases, and in a living way that we can also continue publishing new cases and giving to all the community locally, more tools, practical resources, training programs, because what we have faced here as a barrier locally is two things. First, there is a very few knowledge about the tools that they have in order to go to a different way of ownership. or legal structures or way of funding the projects. And second, for sure, is the investment side. That's why bringing all these tools, all this benchmark, and taking these case studies will give a lot of tools to the rest of the companies to move on this side. We have success cases as Banca Ética or ethical banking here that gathered already 500 investors on equity side in a company that have the voting rights and the economic rights very, very well separately. But still, there is a big group of companies that are struggling with raising money when they wanted to be innovative in how to deal with ownership and growth. And that's why we invite you to joining in this journey. We are, if you have any case or any material or any idea that you can help us in this mapping project, it would be great to join us. And well, thanks for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nelson. Rachel, I'll just go and pass it right to you.
Okay, so can you see my screen? Yep, okay, I'm ready to go then. Okay, so Rachel Bachman, I'm currently working with the Institute for Economic Democracy based in Slovenia, where we're also working on building a European network of organizations to share best practices and advance policy on employee ownership. The IED has also done work not just in Europe, but also in Latin America. You can check out our website for that. And we're currently active on projects in France, Germany, and Serbia specifically. My background is I like to say I grew up in an employee-owned company. I ran my own business for 6 years that was employee-owned, and I was also chair of the board of Employee Ownership Canada for 2 years, during which time we saw the new EOT legislation come in. So just for the purposes of the webinar, I'm just going to define what we're talking about when we say employee ownership. So we're talking about companies that are majority owned by a group that's currently employed. So we're not talking about employee ownership when we're talking about big companies where 2 or 3% of the shareholders are employees. We're talking about majority owned. In some cases, it might be less than the majority. We might be talking about companies that start maybe at 30%, but the aim is to get to a majority owned company. So there might be a transition phase, but the goal is that it will be majority owned. We're also talking about companies where the employees have a voice in the governance. So not just financial participation, but there is some involvement. It doesn't necessarily mean the employees are running the company completely, but there is some element of the employees having a voice or representation in the governance at a minimum. We're also talking about broad-based employee participation. So all or a vast majority of the employees participates. We're not talking about management buyouts. We're talking about everyone, and it's not based on the individual's financial means to be able to pay. So that comes with the next part is it's typically, we see leveraged financing in these transactions because basically you use the future cash flows of the company to reimburse a loan that allows the employees to acquire the company over time without them actually needing any personal upfront investment. So that's a key element of it. So we are talking about companies that are healthy with the ability to reimburse a loan over time from the future cash flows. And that's really why this is such a great tool is we're not reinforcing the current inequalities. We are really allowing all the employees to acquire the company without an upfront investment. So this is the models that I'm going to be talking about. In Europe, so just to position Europe in terms of employee ownership worldwide. So the US got legislation in 1974, the UK in 2014, Canada got it last year in 2024, and now we're expecting both Slovenia and Denmark to get legislation before the end of the year. So shout out to if there's anyone here from Denmark. They're making great progress as well. And so that's when we say legislation, it is those I saw in the chat, the tax incentives that are coming with the transferring the company to the employees. And just in terms of types of models, there's really a lot of different models out there. But I'll just go through a couple of them. So one of the models that we see out there is what we'll call social ownership. So for example, the employee ownership trusts in the UK, the self-managed firms in ex-Yugoslavia, and the SCOP, or the worker co-ops in France. This is an example of social ownership. Financially, it's only profit sharing, so the employees don't have access to the gain in value of the company over the time that they're employed there. They basically get payouts through dividends over time. So it's a profit sharing model. And one of the only things about this is that at one point, the employees get to a point where when the loans are paid off, for the employees to access that gain in value that the company, as it grew, the only thing they can do to get that value is to sell the company. So we're kind of incentivizing them to sell. So there are other mechanisms, but it's kind of like the one thing you don't want is to build this up to then have it sold. So some of the models, and the reason I'm talking about these models is there's kind of like an improvement on, we've learned a lot over time. We've looked at the different models. Every model is kind of trying to improve on the one before. There's also direct ownership. For example, the Sociedades Laborales in Spain. So one of the things about direct ownership is the employees directly own the shares. This is one of the complexities of this is managing the transaction. So you don't have a holdco or a trust or anything holding the shares. So you have to, every time someone leaves, have a transaction. So there's a little bit of complexity with that also, but it introduces the element of equity, sharing equity with the employees, which is a good thing. So that's the improvement that we see there. However, one of the things about when you share equity, and this we see this in the US, it's one of the biggest problems with the US ESOP model too, is that when you have a large group of employees planning to retire at the same time, you end up with a significant repurchase liability. So basically, if you know that you have a lot of people retiring, having their shares come up, and then the fact that you need new people to buy those shares, the company to buy back those shares, you end up building up this repurchase liability, which can be a significant amount, and the company has a hard time with that transaction because it's just such a large amount of money that they're going to have to come up with at a specific time. And also, while those older owners or employees are holding their shares, they're not transferring them to new employees. And the fact is that then if that happens over a significant period of time, you end up with what we call the two companies problem, because you've got a company of owners and you've got a company of new employees that still haven't had access to shares, and so a company of owners and non-owners. And that's what we're trying to avoid. To improve on direct ownership, you have the individual capital allocation, which means that there's a holding or a trust or a special purpose vehicle holding the shares for the employees, so you avoid all the transactions. Mondragon is the typical example of this. So they're gaining equity, they're allocated through what they call individual capital accounts. And then you've got Slovenia, which has added an element to this in their legislation that's coming in with a rollover, which is basically to avoid that repurchase liability and the two companies problem. You buy back the oldest shares on a continual basis. So then you are allocating to the new employees as they're coming in because you're buying back the oldest shares. In terms of sources of financing in Europe, we see banks typically ethical banks. There is even an association for ethical banks in Europe called the FIBIA. So ethical and alternative banks. We see impact investors. The cooperative movement has a lot of funds allocated to worker buyouts as well, and EU cohesion funds. So that's how these are typically financed. And there are successful conversions in Aeon, Slovenia, Iteratec in Germany, and of course Mondragon is the most famous successful model that we can talk about. To finish off, employee-owned companies are protected from being sold through the fact that the employees don't want to lose their jobs. It's kind of inherent, but therefore they keep the jobs anchored in the communities. And contrary to popular belief, are actually a low-risk investment because we have a lot of data on this now. Statistically, employee-owned companies outperform their counterparts in terms of productivity. And this is because of an ownership culture. When someone is an owner and they see something's wrong, they'll call it out. And they're also more resilient. And we saw this through COVID as well. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. I just put in the chat we would love to do the same exact webinar just focused on financing, but if you have questions on financing in different regions, that is definitely a great topic of conversation for these breakouts. So I'll pass it over to Juan at Free Distribution Initiative. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Kurt. Have you all seen my screen? I hope you. Awesome. Well, I'm gonna be quite quick so that we have sufficient time for Q&A. Hi, everyone. I am Juan Ferdinand. I'm Associate Director of the Pre-Distribution Initiative. We are a multi-stakeholder nonprofit that works with investors and their stakeholders to improve financial analysis and decision-making processes in a way that more adequately value workers and communities in order to share more wealth and influence with them. At the beginning of this year, we launched an investor playbook for employee ownership in Sub-Saharan Africa, which provides an analytical approach to advancing employee ownership across 7 countries in the region, offering insights that can be replicated and adapted to other emerging markets. I can put a link to the playbook later in the chat. Well, employee ownership, or EO for short, so to be quick, is more than a business or investment model. It's a national opportunity to improve lives, period. There's have been talked a lot about this in the previous presentations and research, and we need to get right into the bones of this, which is, okay, it could be a good strategy, it could be either for business, for investors, but definitely it's something that could improve lives, especially in regions that have too many problems, challenges in terms of inequality. Well, as EO has the potential to do this in a region as Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see these stats here, which are definitely quite a shame in terms of inequality. We really believe there's a strong opportunity for employee ownership in Sub-Saharan Africa, but only if we invest and collaborate across different types of stakeholders in building the right ecosystem around it. To make employee ownership work in this context, we have to design these structures around the real conditions companies, workers, and investors face across Sub-Saharan Africa. For many workers, as you can probably want to advocate for, the levels of wealth and financial instability that could be reached have been out of reach until now. This is why the main intention of the playbook is to understand how employee ownership can drive positive impacts across the subcontinent, such as tackling inequality, deepening capital markets, and accelerating economic progress. Now, let's be real. There is no shortage of distinct challenges in the region, including the cost of capital, macroeconomic challenges, and business-level operating risk. However, the potential benefits could be even wider ranging and more significant than in any other market. According to our research, the unique challenges for employee ownership implementation in this region fit into 3 core categories: market uptake, impact integrity, and execution complexity. Among some of these challenges are that companies are small, diverse, and often family-owned, which could limit their scalability. Financing is scarce and expensive, while economic volatility and informal labor markets make deals and liquidity harder. There is a lack of legal clarity and stakeholder understanding around employee ownership. An informal workforce excludes many people from ownership opportunities. Plus, employees often prioritize and prefer short-term cash over long-term equity. And finally, legal frameworks vary widely across countries. Ownership rules often are unclear, and few professionals have experience structuring this type of deal. That said, the opportunity to scale employee ownership in the region is still huge. Employee ownership can be a cross-cutting strategy deployable across asset classes. Capacity building by foundations and DFIs can help scale deals via financing facilities or guarantees. And finally, pilot employee ownership transactions can serve as powerful demonstrations for others to follow, especially with an ownership lens approach, such as the one that is currently being taken in North America. Now, I want to very briefly showcase one of the case studies featured in the playbook, Phoenix International. Phoenix was an off-grid energy company founded in 2009 in Zambia and Uganda. The company basically leveraged the rapid improvement of battery storage technologies and mobile payment solutions platforms to offer affordable solar home systems in the region. Phoenix introduced employee ownership through a phantom share or synthetic equity plan called Phoenix Claims. Despite the initial skepticism and misunderstood tax and administrative burdens, Phoenix founder and CEO Lindsay Handler pushed forward with an inclusive and innovative plan to optimize cost, taxes, and scalability of the program. Under this plan, employees earn a participation interest in profits and exit benefits based on salary and company-level responsibility, not performance. This without conferring legal share ownership, but with rights mirroring the benefits of a stock ownership, such as value accrual. When Engie, one of the major energy companies in the world, acquired Phoenix in 2017, some long-term employees earned between 2 times and 5 times their annual salaries as payouts. After the exit, Phoenix CEO founded Delta 40, a venture capital studio with an ownership lens approach that invests in the region and is a leader in the space throughout Africa. I can address the details and technicalities of this deal in the breakout room. However, I can tell you that the main lessons learned from this case study is that the company's transparency, engagement with employees, its founders' drive, plus the innovation and will to legally and financially structure this deal made it a standard employee ownership success in Africa. Now I'll pass it over to Erinch.
Great, thank you so much, Juan. Yeah, Erinch, why don't you close us out for the speaker portion, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions and then go into breakouts.
Wonderful. I'm going to race through mine because I know that there are a lot of questions and it would be wonderful to get into a discussion. I'm going to give a little bit of just a broader picture from the work I'm doing currently at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and take a bit of a step back into why alternative ownership matters, ways we can unlock the narrative in this direction, and the breadth of examples, ideas, models that we're beginning to see. But for those that don't know, this is the donut. We've got planetary boundaries on the outside. We've got the social foundation on the inside, and the green donut-shaped space is a safe and just space for humanity. So that's where we want to get to. That's where the entire economy needs to go to, as a bit of a compass for human prosperity. Now, the reality is we're in huge overshoot on planetary boundaries, and we are falling short on life's essentials, and people on this call do not need reminders on the way that our economies around the world are failing us. Now, if we want to move from that model on the left, where we're in both overshoot and shortfall, to one where we are living within the planet's boundaries and meeting the needs of all, so we're having a thriving society, then we're going to need to recognize that the way we've designed businesses has been blocking transformative action. And there's an opportunity then to redesign ownership to unlock transformative action. So this perspective is at the heart of everything we do at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. How do we redesign businesses, particularly in their ownership model? How do we catalyze this through different angles and perspectives? And how do we do so not just because this is a good thing, whether it's employee ownership, steward ownership, community ownership, social enterprise, mission lock, nature on boards, all these alternative ways to structure the design of companies. These are good things in their own right, but critically, what they do is they unlock the kind of action, strategies, behaviors, investments that we need. So a broader perspective as well, just to sort of, tick this off and recognize that ownership design, alternative ownership models are a critical part of the broader picture, is that yes, we're going to also need regulatory change to regulate the broader market. We're going to need collective action by workers, farmers, communities, etc. We're going to need enlightened leadership. We're going to need better metrics, better targets, and we're going to need to make the business case more effectively. But unless we also change the ownership design of businesses, we end up with companies that lobby against regulation, that fight the interests of workers, farmers, communities, that hold back progressive enlightened action, that maybe set big ambitious targets and measure metrics, but don't actually shift the heart of their business over to make the actions that they need. and that have a very narrow, financially extractive business case that they're focused on. So as an explanation as to why all of this matters and why it's at the heart of everything we do and a lot of the broader new economy movements are doing, for all of these to be effective, we need businesses that are designed to lean into this, to support and not hinder efforts, and to reinforce and drive this ambition. Doughnut Economics focuses on transforming the deep design of business. And what we're seeing is a huge plethora of alternatives that are emerging, for everything from community ownership models that are able to much better balance pricing, for instance, of renewable energy with access to it, with the production of it, such as the Res Co-op community across Europe that is now over 2,000 community-owned renewable energy initiatives and businesses, to employee ownership models, to examples like Nature on the Board that businesses like Faith in Nature are now progressing as well. And of course, steward ownership models that we heard about, mission lock models that are sort of spreading in diverse ways, multi-stakeholder ownership and governance models that are now including suppliers, farmers, workers, employees, the whole set of stakeholders that are impacted through examples like El Puente and verification models like People and Planet First. So there's a huge amount of case studies that we've just launched, 26 of them, that look at all of these diverse ways of designing, in particular, the ownership model of businesses. You'll see some very familiar examples in there, some of the co-ops and mutuals and employee-owned businesses, and really innovative models of ownership design like Library of Things, which deploys both steward ownership, but other examples as well. And the examples are very widespread. They sort of the 26 that we cover around the world, and the critical bit we focused on is what is that ambitious, socially distributive and ecologically regenerative action and strategy that is unlocked and enabled by this kind of enterprise design, this kind of ownership design. What is it that allows this ownership model to then allow for more circular economy, for instance, much fairer, more equitable distribution in supply chains, upholding human rights, much more future-oriented models of business? That is sort of the heart of how we're trying to shift the narrative, and we're getting a lot of success. And the last thing I'll say is we have a tool and a community of practice of over now 120 organizations that are now running business design, Doughnut Design for Business workshops with business leaders, with entrepreneurs and founders and others, to try to unlock and redesign businesses around this agenda. We have a slightly broader framing of enterprise design that includes ownership, but ownership is at the heart of it. And we're very much rolling this out. The last thing I'll mention around this as well, we're starting to see a lot of policy interest. I'm personally involved as part of the Global Expert Committee for the Vice President of Spain, Yolanda Diaz, who is pushing for a redesign and a democratization of business within Spain, building on constitutional opportunities to do so, which may potentially include having a worker representation, as well as initiatives and support for ownership, as well as governance, redesign of companies more broadly across the Spanish economy. We're beginning to see opportunities at city level, organizations and city officials and municipalities setting up, for instance, various support mechanisms, and as well as national level. So I think a broader part of the picture is the credibility, the ambition, and the excitement around this agenda of alternative ownership enterprises is beginning to seep through into much broader systemic change.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erinch. It's always so helpful to hear about this ownership concept in this broader approach to centering business in a completely different way. And everywhere we look at transform finance, we see this question of ownership and governance as ways to develop solutions to so many different types of problems. So in a few minutes, we're going to go to breakout rooms. But I want to ask one question that came up in the chat a couple of times. And maybe we'll have each speaker give 30 seconds on it in a popcorn style, which is around this idea of culture. So we hear a lot about workplace culture, ownership culture, especially when it comes to employees in a business becoming owners. I'm curious how work in different places that you work in, or if you've seen strong cultural differences across different regions, how does the culture of a place factor in to the design, the ability, or the kind of propensity that folks have to do ownership? Because we see pockets around the world of different kinds of alternative ownership enterprises. So what's the role of culture in shaping how these businesses actually look? And whoever of the speakers wants to go first, feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to jump in with an initial point, which is that it comes up a lot. We've run workshops now with over 1,000 business leaders around the world to raise this idea of, look, if you need to shift and transform your business, what does your ownership need to become? What does your governance need to become? And culture comes up. And what comes up around it is that often the extractive model of structuring ownership holds back the possibility of even having the right kind of culture. So a lot of the cultural elements of the business itself, while a structure doesn't guarantee it, an employee-owned business can have loads of problems culturally as well. It's not automatic. Other efforts need to also be supplemented. However, if you have, often a venture capital or private equity-owned business that is extremely extractive, then you're almost guaranteeing that the culture will be toxic and certainly not sustainable or regenerative in its ambitions.
Great. One, I saw you had your hand up, and then just looking at the time, we'll wrap, and then other speakers, you can cover this in your breakout groups.
Sure, Kurt. Thanks. On the case studies that we feature in the Sub-Saharan Africa playbook, what we saw was that culture has to be aligned not only with literacy and education for employees, but also it has to be aligned and linked to the needs of local realities. Like in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's pretty clear that employees prefer short-term cash. So some profit sharing employee ownership structures instead of stock ownerships might be ideal, but like bottom line, culture has to be linked to this clear understanding of the needs of the local realities.
Thanks for that, Juan. Completely agree. All right. Thank you for the all the speakers for this really rich, really insightful, condensed, so much knowledge in these presentations. So now we have an opportunity to really dig in with this breakout format. So I hope everyone can stick around. We're going to launch the rooms right now, and the way it works is we're going to have the topics shown up on the screen, and you should be able to pick your own breakout group, so who you want to go in with. I would say let's try to keep the rooms as even as possible. So if you're kind of split between a few, I would recommend going to a breakout that has fewer people, just so we can have every group be as intimate as possible. But we really want to make sure that folks are in a room that's really relevant for their work. And I'll post a few starting questions in the chat for each breakout to start to consider and go off of, but feel free to go off script and dig into whatever conversations emerge that is exciting for you all. So with that, the breakout rooms are launched. So feel free to go ahead and choose your room. I want to close this out with a quick announcement, bringing us back to the US, as that's actually one of the regions that we did not cover today, but it's still very important and something that Transform Finance has been working a lot on. We have a new piece coming out today, building off of research of Rutgers on the investable opportunity for employee ownership in the US. So looking at the number of relevant businesses for conversions, doing some modeling on what kind of capital and how much capital is actually needed to get the requisite funding for employee ownership to help the current movement here in the US grow and scale. So I would also say that a lot of the financing requirements and particularities for employee ownership and alternative ownership enterprises generally is quite similar across markets. That was one of the questions in the chat that I wish we had more time to get into is, what are the common themes when it comes to financing? I would highly recommend checking out the piece that we shared from Harvey in SSIR that looks at the need for catalytic capital in different markets around the globe. So you'll be seeing that in your inboxes today. I hope it's useful for those who are especially focused in the US, but can also take learnings to wherever you are currently working here. So with a few minutes left here, I wanted to give any of the speakers and breakout room leads, is there any big reflections or inspiring words to help call folks to action that you would relay in these final minutes? Stop my share.
I'm happy to jump in with just 3 insights from our group on movements. First is that these alternative ownership models can cut across politically polarized realities. That, we have examples of center-right think tanks and conservative movers also being interested in employee ownership, for instance, and shared ownership, and even democratic business using terminology such as that. So there's an opportunity to drive change. The second is the connection with environmental movements, circular economy, climate justice, as well as with labor rights, trade union, etc., can be really strong. And to do so, we need to demonstrate that these movements or these models can enable the sort of transitions that are being held back currently, that those movements are frustrated because whether it's climate, circularity, etc., businesses aren't transforming. If we transform ownership, we help to unlock their solutions, their challenges. And the last one is that, it starts at a grassroots level as well. Even if national level change seems difficult, frustrating, we can do things, we can drive change at a local level using alternative ownership.
Maybe I can jump in, Kurt. I think we talked a little bit about how great the movement of impact investing and all that in the US is, and we're really hoping to see it move to Europe as well. So I think that was just one of the highlights of what we did in our session, but lots of really good questions too.
Great. Nelson, Harvey, Juan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, we focus mainly on the cooperative movement and trying to compare what was happening in the US and Canada with LATAM and some indigenous based initiatives. And for sure, we have cultural issues here quite different than the challenges that you have in Europe or in the United States. And that was mainly what we talk about.
In our breakout room, basically, we discussed how, despite the local challenges in the Sub-Saharan Africa region, there's quite a potential to structure this type of deals if the local realities are acknowledged and if the robust ecosystem is built.
And in our group, looking at Asia, there were a few people who are actually actively looking at trying to do this, in the areas that they're operating and investing in. There was a challenge around how you bridge from sort of small scale to large scale, and we talked about some ways of doing that, and that's a much deeper discussion. Also, a discussion about how you change the paradigm. How do we get to a place where people don't think this is some crazy idea, but actually something that can work and can be done successfully.
Yeah, my point fits really well here. We were just talking about how there's so many entrepreneurs that are actively looking for different solutions and are wanting to set up their companies in a different way from conventionally structured companies. And whether employee ownership is the right fit for them or steward ownership or something completely else, it just they need to be more aware of these types of solutions. They need to be more those solutions need to be more accessible, and then it just needs to feel really like a well fit for them. Because if it's something that's externally kind of pushed onto them, I don't think that it will actually work. So it also needs to come from inside the companies.
This is beautiful. We'll do a share back. I feel like all of these closing words contained a quote that I would love to to capture and share. So I'm glad this is being recorded. Okay, with that, thank you, everyone. Please, feel free to send feedback. I think there's a Zoom survey that'll pop up. And let us know what you would love to talk about next. I know we covered a lot here, but we really want to go deep on the things that our audience is most excited about. So with that, I'll let you all get on with your days, no matter what time zone you're in. And thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. And thank you especially to the really amazing set of speakers here. You all are really leading the way, and we at Transform Finance appreciate it so much.
So much.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, friends.